years, and was achieved in 19 years from the introduction of the first Model T, 1908. 19. Henry Ford turned the presidency of Ford Motor Company over to his son Edsel Ford in December 1918. Henry retained final decision authority and sometimes reversed the decisions of his son. Ford started another company, Henry Ford and Son, and made a show of taking himself and his best employees to the new company. The goal was to scare the remaining holdout stockholders of the Ford Motor Company to sell their stakes to him before they lost most of their value. He was determined to have full control over strategic decisions. The ruse worked, and Ford and Edsel purchased all remaining stock from the other investors, thus giving the family sole ownership of the company. 20. In 1922, Ford also purchased Lincoln Motor Company, founded by Cadillac founder Henry Leland and his son Wilfred during World War I. The Lelands briefly stayed to manage the company, but were soon expelled from it. 21. Despite this acquisition of a premium car maker, Henry displayed relatively little enthusiasm for luxury automobiles in contrast to Edsel, who actively sought to expand Ford into the upscale market. 22. The original Lincoln Model L that the Lelands had introduced in 1920 was also kept in production untouched for a decade until it became too outdated. It was replaced by the modernized Model K in 1931. A 1926 Ford T Roadster on display in 9 by the mid-1920s, General Motors was rapidly rising as the leading American automobile manufacturer. GM President Alfred Sloan established the company's price ladder whereby GM would offer an automobile for every purse and purpose in contrast to Ford's lack of interest in anything outside the low-end market. Although Henry Ford was against replacing the Model T, now 16 years old Chevrolet was mounting a bold new challenge as Graham's entry-level division in the company's price ladder. Ford also resisted the increasingly popular idea of payment plans for cars. With model sales starting to slide, Ford was forced to relent and approve work on a successor model, shutting down production for 18 months. During this time, Ford constructed a massive new assembly plant at River Rouge for the new Model O, which launched in 1927. 23. In addition to its price ladder, GM also quickly established itself at the forefront of automotive styling under Harley Earl's Arts and Color department, another area of automobile design that Henry Ford did not entirely appreciate or understand. Ford would not have a true equivalent of the GM styling department for many years. Modeler and Ford's later career. By 1926, flagging sales of the Model T finally convinced Ford to make a new model. He pursued the project with a great deal of interest in the design of the engine, chassis, and other mechanical necessities while leaving the body design to his son. Although Ford fancied himself an engineering genius, he had little formal training in mechanical engineering and could not even read a blueprint. A talented team of engineers performed most of the actual work of designing the Model O, and later the Flathead V8, with Ford supervising them closely and giving them overall direction. Edsel also managed to prevail over his father's initial objections in the inclusion of a sliding shift transmission. 24. The result was the successful Ford Model O, introduced in December 1927 and produced through 1931 with a total output of more than 4 million. Subsequently, the Ford company adopted an annual model change system similar to that recently pioneered by its competitor General Motors, and still in use by automakers today. Not until the 1930s did Ford overcome his objection to finance companies, and Ford-owned Universal Credit Corporation became a major car financing operation. Henry Ford still resisted many technological innovations such as hydraulic brakes and all-metal roofs, which Ford vehicles did not adopt until 1935-36. For 1932, however, Ford dropped a bombshell with the far-feed Ford V8, first low-price 8-cylinder engine. The far-feed V8, variants of which were used in Ford vehicles for 20 years, was the result of a secret project launched in 1930, and Henry had initially considered a radical X8 engine before agreeing to a conventional design. It gave Ford a reputation as a performance make well suited for hot rodding. 25. Ford did not believe in accountants. He amassed one of the world's largest fortunes without ever having his company audited under his administration. Without an accounting department, Ford had no way of knowing exactly how much money was being taken in and spent each month, and the company's bills and invoices were reportedly guessed at by weighing them on a scale. Not until 1956 would Ford be a publicly traded company. 26. Also, at Edsall's insistence, Ford launched Mercury in 1939 as a mid-range make to challenge Dodge and Bic, although Henry also displayed relatively little enthusiasm for it. 22. Labor philosophy. $5 wage. Time magazine, January 14, 1935. Ford was a pioneer of welfare capitalism, designed to improve the lot of his workers and especially to reduce the heavy turnover that had many departments hiring 300 men per year to fill 100 slots. Efficiency meant hiring and keeping the best workers. 27. Ford astonished the world in 1914 by offering a $5 per day wage, $1.40 today, which more than doubled the rate of most of his workers. 28. A Cleveland, Ohio, newspaper editorialized that the announcement shot like a blinding rocket through the dark clouds of the present industrial depression. 29. The move proved extremely profitable. Instead of constant employee turnover, the best mechanics in Detroit flocked to Ford, bringing the human capital and expertise, raising productivity, and lowering running costs. 30. 31. Ford announced his $5 per day program on January 5, 1914, raising the minimum daily pay from $2.34 to $5 for qualifying male workers. 32. 33. Detroit was already a high-wage city, but competitors were forced to raise wages or lose their best workers. 34. Ford's policy proved that paying employees more would enable them to afford the cars they were producing and thus boost the local economy. He viewed the increased wages as profit sharing linked with rewarding those who were most productive and of good character. 35. It may have been cousins who convinced Ford to adopt the $5-day wage. 36. Real profit sharing was offered to employees who had worked at the company for 6 months or more, and importantly, conducted their lives in a manner of which Ford's social department approved. They frowned on heavy drinking, gambling, and on what are now called deadbeat dads. The social department used 50 investigators and support staff to maintain employee standards. A large percentage of workers were able to qualify for this profit sharing. 37. Ford's incursion into his employees' private lives was highly controversial, and he soon backed off from the most intrusive aspects. By the time he wrote his 1922 memoir, he had spoken of the social department and private conditions for profit sharing in the past tense. He admitted that paternalism has no place in the industry. Welfare work that consists in prying into employees' private concerns is out of date. Men need counsel and men need help, often special help, and all this ought to be rendered for decency's sake. But the broad workable plan of investment and participation will do more to solidify the industry and strengthen the organization than will any social work on the outside. Without changing the principle, we have changed the method of payment. 38. 5-day work week. In addition to raising his workers' wages, Ford also introduced a new, reduced work week in 1926. Pegasus Scion was made in 1922, when Ford and Crowther described it as 6 8-hour days, giving a 48-hour week, 39. But in 1926 it was announced as 5 8-hour days, giving a 40-hour week. 40. The program apparently started with Saturday being designated a workday, before becoming a day off sometime later. On the 1st of May, 1926, the Ford Motor Company's factory workers switched to a 5-day, 40-hour work week, with the company's office workers making the transition the following August. 41. Ford had decided to boost productivity, as workers were expected to put more effort into their work in exchange for more leisure time. Ford also believed decent leisure time was good for business, giving workers additional time to purchase and consume more goods. However, charitable concerns also played a role. Ford explained, "It is high time to rid ourselves of the notion that leisure for workmen is either lost time or a class privilege." 41. Labor unions. Ford was adamantly against labor unions. He explained his views on unions in Chapter 18 of My Life and Work. 42. He thought they were too heavily influenced by leaders who would end up doing more harm than good for workers despite their ostensible good motives. Most wanted to restrict productivity as a means to foster employment, but Ford saw this as self-defeating because, in his view, productivity was necessary for economic prosperity to exist. He believed that productivity gains that obviated certain jobs would nevertheless stimulate the broader economy and grow new jobs elsewhere, whether within the same corporation or in others. Ford also believed that union leaders had a perverse incentive to foment perpetual socio-economic crises to maintain the power. Meanwhile, he believed that smart managers had an incentive to do right by their workers because doing so would maximize their profits. However, Ford did acknowledge that many managers were basically too bad at managing to understand this fact. But Ford believed that eventually, if good managers such as he could fend off the attacks of misguided people from both left and right, i.e., both socialists and bad manager reactionaries, the good managers would create a socio-economic system wherein neither bad management nor bad unions could find enough support to continue existing. To forestall union activity, Ford promoted Harry Bennett, a former Navy boxer, to head the service department. Bennett employed various intimidation tactics to quash union organizing. 43. On March 7, 1932, during the Great Depression, unemployed Detroit auto workers staged the Ford Hunger March to the Ford River Rouge complex to present 14 demands to Henry Ford. The Dearborn Police Department and Ford security guards opened fire on workers, leading to over 60 injuries and 5 deaths. On May 26, 1937, Bennett's security men beat members of the United Automobile Workers, UAW, including Walter Reuther, with clubs. 44. While Bennett's men were beating the UAW representatives, the supervising police chief on the scene was Carl Brooks, an alumnus of Bennett's service department, and Brooks did not give orders to intervene. 44. 311. The following day, photographs of the injured UAW members appeared in newspapers, later becoming known as the Battle of the Overpass. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, Edsel, who was president of the company, thought Ford had to commit to a collective bargaining agreement with the unions because the violence, work disruptions, and bitter stalemates could not go on forever. But Ford, who still had the final veto in the company on a de facto basis, even if not an official one, refused to cooperate. For several years, he kept Bennett in charge of talking to unions trying to organize the Ford Motor Company. Sorensen's memoir, 45, makes clear that Ford's purpose in putting Bennett in charge was to make sure no agreements were ever reached. The Ford Motor Company was the last Detroit automaker to recognize the UAW, despite pressure from the rest of the U.S. automotive industry and even the U.S. government. A sit-down strike by the UAW union in April 1941 closed the River Rouge plant. Sorensen recounted, 46, that a distraught Henry Ford was very close to following through with a threat to break up the company rather than cooperate. Still, his wife Clara told him she would leave him if he destroyed the family business. In her view, it would not be worth the chaos it would create. Ford complied with his wife's ultimatum and even agreed with her in retrospect. Overnight, the Ford Motor Company went from the most stubborn holdout among automakers to the one with the most favorable UAW contract terms. The contract was signed in June 1941. 46. About a year later, Ford told Walter Reuther, "It was one of the most sensible things Harry Bennett ever did when he got the UAW into this plant." Reuther inquired, "What do you mean?" Ford replied, "Well, you've been fighting General Motors and the Wall Street crowd. Now you're in here and we've given you a union shop and more than you got out of them. That puts you on our side, doesn't it? We can fight General Motors and Wall Street together, eh?" 47. Ford Airplane Company. Ford Fort F. ECRA, of the Spanish Republican airline, L.P.E. Like other automobile companies, Ford entered the aviation business during World War I, building Liberty engines. After the it returned to auto manufacturing until 1925. When Ford acquired the Stout Metal Airplane Company. Ford's most successful aircraft was the Ford Fort Trimotor, often called the Tin Goose because of its corrugated metal construction. It used a new alloy called Alclad that combined the corrosion resistance of aluminum with the strength of duralumin. The plane was similar to Focke's V-7-3M, and some say that Ford's engineers surreptitiously measured a Fokker plane and then copied it. The Trimotor first flew on the 11th of June, 1926, and was the first successful U.S. passenger airliner, accommodating about 12 passengers in a rather uncomfortable fashion. Several variants were also used by the U.S. Army. The Smithsonian Institution has honored Ford for changing the aviation industry. 199 Trimotors were built before it was discontinued in 1933, when the Ford Airplane division shut down because of poor sales during the Great Depression. In 1985, Ford was posthumously inducted into the National Aviation Hall of Fame for his impact on the industry. 48. World War I era and peace activism. Ford opposed war, which he viewed as a terrible waste. 49. 50, and supported causes that opposed military intervention. 51. Ford became highly critical of those who he felt financed war, and he tried to stop them. In 1915, the pacifist Rosica Schwimmer gained favor with Ford, who agreed to fund a peace ship to Europe where World War I was raging. He led 170 other peace activists. Ford's Episcopalian pastor, Reverend Samuel S. Marquise, accompanied him on the mission. Marquise headed Ford's sociology department from 1913 to 1921. Ford talked to President Woodrow Wilson about the mission but had no government support. His group went to neutral Sweden and the Netherlands to meet with peace activists. A target of mock ridicule, Ford left the ship as soon as it reached Sweden. 52. In 1915, Ford blamed German Jewish bankers for instigating the war. 53. According to biographer Stephen Watts, Ford's status as a leading industrialist gave him a worldview that warfare was wasteful folly that retarded long-term economic growth. The losing side in the war typically suffered heavy damage. Small business were especially hurt, for it takes years to recuperate. He argued in many newspaper articles that a focus on business efficiency would discourage warfare because, if every man who manufactures an article would make the very best he can in the very best way at the very lowest possible price, the world would be kept out of war. For